For more than a decade, Crimea has stood at the center of one of Europe's most consequential geopolitical conflicts. Ever since Russia annexed the peninsula in 2014, the region has become both a symbol of Russian power and a strategic military hub that supports operations across southern Ukraine. For Moscow, holding Crimea is not simply about territory. It is about prestige, military influence, and the ability to project power across the Black Sea. But in the summer of 2026, a new phase of the war has emerged. This phase is not defined by dramatic tank battles, massive troop movements, or large-scale offensives that dominate newspaper headlines. Instead, it is being fought through bridges, highways, fuel depots, supply trucks, and drone strikes. What is unfolding across southern Ukraine is a systematic campaign designed to weaken Russia's ability to sustain its forces in Crimea and along the southern front. According to Ukrainian military officials, the objective is straightforward: isolate Crimea. And over the past several weeks, events suggest that Ukraine may be making significant progress toward that goal. Tonight, we examine how a series of carefully coordinated strikes transformed little-known bridges and supply routes into some of the most strategically important targets in the war. Because what happened in June could reshape the military balance across southern Ukraine for months to come. Why Crimea matters. To understand the significance of recent events, it is important to understand Crimea's role in the conflict. Crimea occupies a unique position on the map. Connected to mainland Ukraine by only a handful of narrow land corridors, the peninsula extends deep into the Black Sea and hosts several critical military installations. Russia's Black Sea Fleet has long operated from Sevastopol, while air bases, logistics centers, ammunition depots, and command facilities are scattered across the region. For Russian military planners, Crimea serves as both a fortress and a staging ground. Troops, equipment, fuel, and ammunition flow through the peninsula before being distributed to units fighting across occupied areas of southern Ukraine. As long as these supply routes remain intact, Russian forces can maintain operations over a vast geographic area. But if those routes are disrupted, every military activity becomes more difficult. Fuel shortages affect transport. Ammunition shortages reduce combat effectiveness. Delays in resupply slow offensive operations. And damaged infrastructure creates bottlenecks that can quickly become vulnerabilities. This is the principle Ukraine appears to be exploiting. Rather than focusing exclusively on frontline battles, Ukrainian forces have increasingly concentrated on the systems that keep those battles running. And nowhere is that strategy more visible than in Crimea. Military historians often describe logistics as the invisible side of warfare. Armies may win battles through tactics and firepower, but they survive through supply networks. Every vehicle requires fuel. Every artillery piece requires shells. Every soldier requires food, water, medical supplies, and equipment. When those resources stop arriving, military effectiveness begins to decline. Throughout history, some of the most significant victories have resulted not from direct combat, but from the disruption of enemy supply lines. Napoleon's armies suffered from logistical collapse during the invasion of Russia. German forces faced similar challenges during World War II. And modern militaries remain dependent on transportation networks despite advances in technology. Bridges, railways, roads, ports, and fuel facilities remain critical. Destroy enough of them, and even a powerful military can struggle to function effectively. Ukraine appears to have embraced this lesson. Over recent months, Ukrainian drone operators, intelligence teams, and special units have concentrated increasing attention on Russian logistics. Rather than seeking symbolic victories, they have targeted the infrastructure that enables Russian military operations. And according to multiple reports, the results have been increasingly visible. A changing battlefield. Earlier phases of the war often focused on large-scale offensives. Cities became focal points. Front lines shifted slowly. Territory gained or lost dominated public discussion. But by 2026, warfare has evolved. Drones now play a central role. Small teams operating hundreds of kilometers from the front can identify targets, relay coordinates, and conduct strikes with remarkable precision. The cost of a drone can be dramatically lower than the value of the equipment it destroys. This asymmetry has changed battlefield calculations. Military convoys that once moved with relative confidence must now assume they are being watched. Fuel depots can become targets within hours of being identified. Bridges that previously appeared secure can suddenly become vulnerable. The result is a new type of battlefield where logistics networks are constantly exposed to surveillance and attack. Ukraine's recent campaign against Crimean supply routes demonstrates how effectively these tools can be used. Crimea's geography creates both strengths and weaknesses. The peninsula is connected to occupied territories through only a limited number of major crossings. This means supply routes are concentrated. Large volumes of traffic must pass through relatively few locations. For military planners, these crossings are essential. For drone operators, they represent opportunities. If one crossing becomes unusable, traffic is redirected elsewhere. That concentration increases congestion. Congestion creates predictable movement patterns, and predictable movement patterns create targets. This appears to be exactly what Ukrainian planners anticipated. Rather than treating individual bridges as isolated objectives, they seem to have viewed the entire network as a single system. Damage one crossing, observe where traffic moves, then target the alternative. The strategy is simple in concept, but potentially devastating in practice. And according to Ukrainian accounts, that is precisely what unfolded in June. The first strikes. In early June, Ukrainian forces intensified attacks against key crossings linking occupied southern Ukraine with Crimea. One of the most significant targets was the Chonhar crossing. For years, this route served as one of the most direct connections between Crimea and occupied mainland territories. Military cargo frequently moved through the area. Fuel convoys relied upon it. Supply vehicles passed across it daily. Because of its importance, many analysts regarded it as a critical component of Russia's southern logistics network. When Ukrainian drones struck the crossing, the immediate damage was significant. Traffic disruptions followed, repair efforts began, alternative routes became necessary. But the most important consequence was not the physical destruction itself, it was the chain reaction that followed. Once traffic began moving elsewhere, new vulnerabilities emerged, and Ukrainian planners were ready to exploit them. The bottleneck effect. Military logistics depends on flexibility. When one route is unavailable, another route must absorb the additional traffic. However, alternative routes often lack the capacity to handle sudden increases. The result is congestion. Convoys slow down, waiting times increase, vehicles accumulate, and concentrated traffic becomes easier to locate. From a military perspective, bottlenecks are dangerous. They reduce maneuverability, they limit options, and they create predictable targets. Imagine hundreds of vehicles attempting to cross a limited number of bridges. Even without direct observation, planners can often predict where congestion will occur. Modern surveillance capabilities make those predictions even more accurate. Drones can monitor routes. Satellite imagery can identify movement patterns. Intelligence sources can provide additional information. When all of these capabilities are combined, a bottleneck can quickly become a liability. This appears to have been one of Ukraine's key objectives. By damaging critical crossings, they forced Russian logistics into increasingly narrow channels. Once those channels became crowded, they became vulnerable. A new phase of the campaign. What makes this campaign particularly noteworthy is the level of coordination involved. Historically, many military strikes focused on individual targets. A bridge would be hit, a fuel depot would be attacked, an ammunition storage site would be destroyed. While effective, such operations often remained isolated. The recent strikes appeared different. Instead of isolated attacks, they resemble a broader effort to systematically degrade an entire logistics system. Bridges are targeted, alternative routes are monitored, traffic shifts, new strikes follow, the process repeats. Over time, options become increasingly limited. For Russian commanders, this creates difficult choices. Protecting every bridge is impossible. Concentrating defenses around one crossing leaves another exposed. Dispersing defenses reduces effectiveness everywhere. The dilemma grows more severe as the number of threatened locations increases, and Ukraine appears intent on maintaining that pressure. The strategic objective. When military analysts discuss isolating a region, they do not necessarily mean capturing it immediately. Isolation can occur gradually. A region becomes harder to supply. Transportation becomes less reliable. Fuel becomes scarce. Military operations become more expensive and more difficult. Eventually, the cost of maintaining control rises significantly. This concept is central to understanding the current situation. Ukraine does not necessarily need to launch a massive assault against Crimea to create problems for Russian forces there. Instead, it can target the systems that sustain those forces. Every disrupted convoy matters. Every damaged bridge matters. Every delayed shipment matters. Individually, these incidents may appear limited. Collectively, they can have substantial effects. Military history offers numerous examples where supply disruptions produced consequences far beyond the immediate damage inflicted. Ukraine appears to be pursuing a similar logic. Russia's challenge. For Russia, the challenge is considerable. Crimea remains strategically important. Maintaining military operations requires a steady flow of resources. Those resources must travel through routes that are increasingly under threat. Repair crews can restore damaged infrastructure, but repairs require time. Temporary solutions can be implemented, but temporary solutions often lack capacity. Additional security measures can be deployed, but resources are finite. Every defensive asset assigned to one location cannot simultaneously protect another. As the campaign continues, Russian planners face mounting pressure to preserve logistics while adapting to evolving threats. That balancing act is becoming increasingly complex. The events unfolding around Crimea are about far more than individual bridges or isolated drone strikes. They represent a broader contest over logistics, mobility, and sustainability. Ukraine appears determined to weaken Russia's ability to move fuel, ammunition, and equipment through southern Ukraine and into Crimea. Russia, meanwhile, is attempting to preserve routes that remain essential for military operations. The outcome of this struggle may influence not only conditions on the peninsula itself, but also the wider battlefield across southern Ukraine. In Part 2, we will examine the dramatic strikes that reportedly trapped convoys, the destruction that followed, and how Ukraine's strategy transformed alternative supply routes into dangerous bottlenecks. Because according to multiple reports, what happened next may have been one of the most significant blows to Russian logistics since the beginning of the war. By early June 2026, the battle for Crimea had entered a new and increasingly dangerous phase. The strikes against key bridges connecting occupied southern Ukraine to the Crimean Peninsula were no longer isolated incidents. Instead, they appeared to form part of a coordinated campaign aimed at disrupting the entire logistics network that sustained Russian military operations in the region. For Russian commanders, the situation was becoming increasingly difficult. Every damaged crossing forced traffic onto alternative routes. Every alternative route created new bottlenecks. And every bottleneck offered Ukrainian drone operators another opportunity. What happened next would demonstrate just how vulnerable a modern military supply system can become when its options begin to disappear. According to Ukrainian military sources, one particular crossing near the city of Armyansk suddenly became the focal point of Russia's southern logistics effort. Within days, it would also become one of the most dangerous places for Russian military vehicles anywhere in occupied Ukraine. This is the story of how a bridge that few people outside the region had ever heard of became the center of one of the most significant logistics battles of the war. The strikes against the Chonhar crossing created an immediate problem for Russian military planners. For years, the route had served as one of the most efficient links between occupied mainland territories and Crimea. Convoys carrying ammunition, fuel, spare parts, food supplies, and military equipment routinely used the crossing. When damage forced restrictions on movement, those supplies still needed to reach their destinations. Military operations could not simply stop. Alternative routes therefore became essential. Among the most important was the corridor running through Armyansk. Under normal circumstances, this route handled a manageable volume of traffic, but normal circumstances no longer existed. As vehicles were redirected away from damaged crossings, pressure on Armyansk increased rapidly. More trucks arrived, more fuel tankers appeared, more military cargo moved through the area. What had once been an alternative route was quickly becoming a primary route. And according to Ukrainian officials, that was exactly what they expected to happen. Anticipating the shift. One of the most remarkable aspects of the campaign was the apparent degree of preparation involved. Ukrainian commanders later suggested that they anticipated Russia would redirect traffic toward Armyansk following earlier strikes. If true, this would mean that the operation was not reactive. It was proactive. Rather than waiting to see where Russia moved its supplies, Ukrainian planners had already identified likely alternatives. Once Russian logistics shifted in the expected direction, surveillance efforts intensified. Drone operators monitored traffic patterns. Reconnaissance assets observed movement. Intelligence teams collected information about vehicle concentrations and route usage. The objective was straightforward. If Russia concentrated its logistics through a limited number of crossings, those crossings could become targets. And if enough traffic accumulated in one place, the consequences of a successful strike could be significant. The night of the strike. According to reports from Ukrainian military units involved in the operation, events moved quickly. Surveillance reportedly identified a concentration of vehicles moving through the Armyansk corridor. Many of those vehicles were said to be carrying fuel, ammunition, and other military supplies destined for Russian forces operating in southern Ukraine. The timing was important. Military logistics often depends on predictable schedules. Supplies must arrive when units need them. Delays can create operational problems. As a result, commanders sometimes have little choice but to keep traffic moving despite increasing risks. For Ukrainian operators, the concentration of vehicles represented an opportunity. Drone strikes were prepared, targets were identified, attack plans were finalized. Then, the operation began. What followed would become one of the most discussed logistics strikes of the campaign. Fire on the crossing. Reports from Ukrainian sources described large explosions and extensive fires. Vehicles carrying fuel are particularly vulnerable during attacks. Fuel can ignite. Secondary explosions may occur. Nearby vehicles can become trapped. Congestion can make escape difficult. If a convoy is already bottlenecked on a bridge or narrow roadway, drivers have limited room to maneuver. Even minor disruptions can rapidly escalate into major incidents. According to Ukrainian claims, dozens of military vehicles were destroyed or damaged during the strike. Those claims have been difficult to independently verify in full, as is often the case in wartime reporting. However, satellite imagery, videos circulating online, and subsequent traffic disruptions suggested that significant damage occurred. Whether the exact numbers were as high as reported or somewhat lower, the strategic effect was clear. The crossing became increasingly difficult to use, and Russia's logistics network faced another major setback. Why bottlenecks matter. To understand why strikes like this attract so much attention, it is important to understand the concept of concentration risk. Military supply systems depend on movement. The more options available, the harder it becomes to disrupt logistics. But when routes are reduced, concentration increases. Imagine a city with 10 roads leading into it. Closing one road may have little effect. Closing 8 roads creates a very different situation. Traffic begins to accumulate. Alternative routes become crowded. Travel times increase. Predictability increases. Vulnerability increases. This principle applies equally to military logistics. When several crossings become unusable or damaged, surviving routes carry greater importance. That increased importance makes them attractive targets. And when large numbers of vehicles are forced onto the same road, the consequences of a successful attack become magnified. This is exactly why the Armyansk corridor attracted so much attention. It was not merely a bridge, it was part of a shrinking network, and shrinking networks are inherently vulnerable. Drones changed the equation. A decade ago, operations of this kind would have required significant resources. Aircraft might have been needed. Long-range missiles could have been necessary. Extensive coordination would have been required. Today, drones have changed the equation. Modern strike drones offer several advantages. They can remain over target areas for extended periods. They provide real-time observation. They can identify movement patterns before committing to an attack. And they are often significantly less expensive than traditional weapon systems. For Ukraine, drones have become one of the most effective tools available. They allow operators to monitor supply routes continuously. They enable rapid responses when opportunities emerge. And they create uncertainty for Russian forces attempting to move supplies. Every convoy must now consider the possibility that it is being watched. Every bridge crossing carries additional risk. Every traffic jam becomes a potential target. The psychological effect of this environment can be almost as important as the physical damage itself. Multiple pressure points. Another key feature of the campaign was the use of simultaneous pressure across different areas. Military analysts often emphasize the importance of forcing an opponent to divide resources. If defenses can concentrate in one location, they may be highly effective. If defenses must cover numerous locations simultaneously, effectiveness often declines. According to Ukrainian accounts, strikes and reconnaissance activities were occurring across multiple sectors at the same time. This forced Russian commanders to make difficult decisions regarding air defense coverage and resource allocation. Should defenses focus on bridges? Should they protect fuel depots? Should they prioritize command centers? Should they defend industrial facilities? There was no perfect answer. Every choice involved risk. And Ukraine appeared determined to increase the number of difficult choices facing Russian planners. The broader campaign. The Armyansk strike did not occur in isolation. Instead, it formed part of a larger effort targeting transportation infrastructure throughout occupied southern Ukraine. Bridges received particular attention. The reason is simple. Bridges cannot easily be replaced. Roads can sometimes be rerouted. Vehicles can take alternative paths. But bridges often represent fixed points within a transportation network. Destroying or damaging them can have disproportionate effects. Repairing them requires time. Temporary crossings often have lower capacity. Military engineers can develop solutions, but those solutions rarely restore full functionality immediately. As a result, every successful bridge strike increases pressure elsewhere in the system. That pressure then creates new opportunities for future operations. This cycle became increasingly visible throughout June. Fire control. Military analysts frequently use the term fire control when discussing strategic infrastructure. The concept does not necessarily require permanent destruction. Instead, it involves maintaining the ability to strike a target repeatedly. If repair crews know a bridge may be attacked again, repairs become more difficult. If vehicles know a crossing remains under observation, movement becomes riskier. If commanders cannot guarantee safe passage, planning becomes more complicated. This is one of the most significant developments in modern warfare. Control is no longer determined solely by physical occupation. Sometimes the ability to threaten a target continuously can produce similar effects. Ukraine's campaign appears designed around this principle. Rather than destroying every crossing permanently, Ukrainian forces seek to make those crossings difficult, dangerous, and uncertain to use. The cumulative impact can be substantial. A logistics system under stress. By mid-June, evidence suggested increasing strain across Russia's southern logistics network. Traffic patterns changed. Alternative routes became more heavily used. Repair efforts intensified. Security measures expanded. At the same time, Ukrainian strikes continued. Each new attack forced additional adjustments. Each adjustment created new vulnerabilities. Military logistics functions best when routes are predictable, secure, and efficient. The situation around Crimea increasingly reflected the opposite conditions. Routes were changing, security concerns were growing, efficiency was declining, and uncertainty was becoming a constant factor. For commanders attempting to sustain operations over long distances, these trends posed serious challenges. Strategic consequences. The significance of these developments extends beyond individual bridges and convoys. Military campaigns depend on momentum. Maintaining that momentum requires continuous supply. Fuel powers vehicles. Ammunition supports combat operations. Replacement equipment compensates for battlefield losses. Medical supplies sustain personnel. When logistics become more difficult, military flexibility decreases. Commanders may still conduct operations, but they often do so with greater risk and reduced options. This is why logistics has historically been considered one of the foundations of military power. And it is why Ukraine's campaign has attracted growing attention from military observers around the world. The objective is not merely to destroy infrastructure, it is to reduce Russia's ability to use that infrastructure effectively. By June 2026, the battle for Crimea had evolved into something far more sophisticated than a series of isolated drone strikes. Ukraine was increasingly targeting the connections that held Russia's southern logistics network together. The strikes against Chonhar created pressure. That pressure redirected traffic. The redirected traffic increased reliance on Armyansk. And the growing concentration of vehicles created opportunities that Ukrainian forces were prepared to exploit. Whether measured in damaged bridges, disrupted convoys, or delayed supplies, the effects were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Yet the story was far from over. Because as military logistics came under pressure, another crisis was beginning to emerge across Crimea itself. A crisis involving fuel shortages, civilian frustration, economic disruption, and growing concerns about the long-term sustainability of Russian operations on the peninsula. In Part 3, we examine how battlefield logistics began affecting everyday life, why fuel shortages spread across Crimea, and what these developments could mean for the future of the conflict.